His paper is entitled My Benjamin Gratz Problem and Ours. And in addition, we're going to have comments by Daniel Vivian of the UK College of Design Historic Preservation Program. And I'm just going to say a little bit about the structure of what we're going to do, and then I'll introduce our two speakers and then let them go ahead. So we're going to have, everyone should have received the paper that Jeremy kindly distributed in a very timely fashion for us, and a short paper too. And he's going to give a short introduction to his project and to the writing. Then Dan's going to offer some comments on the paper and on the project and a set of framing questions for our discussion. Jeremy can choose to respond or not, but then we'll open it up to wider conversation. And so we should have a good hour for everyone to have conversation. If you have questions as they're speaking, feel free to put them in the chat and I'll connect with those questions. I'll bring them up. If you want to ask a question in the chat, you can do that. After we have our speakers talk, I would ask that you use the hand raise function to raise your hand, and I'll call on you. That's the easiest way to do it. And I'll periodically check in with the chat. So without further ado, let me introduce Jeremy Popkin is the William T. Bryan Chair Professor of History at University of Kentucky. His scholarly interests include the history of the French and Haitian revolutions and the topic of autobiographical literature. He's the author of numerous books and over 150 articles. His most recent book is A New World Begins, The History of the French Revolution, published by Basic Books in 2019. According to his website, he's busy at work on 3 new projects, and I think this paper might have links to all 3 of those. And the paper today is entitled My Benjamin Gratz Problem and Ours. And then our commenter, Daniel Vivian, is a historian who has been involved with historic preservation throughout his career. He's the author of numerous publications, including the book, A New Plantation World, Sporting Plantations, the South Carolina Low Country, 1900 to 1940. His current research concentrates on historical memory of slavery in the era between the world wars, and he has been involved in numerous projects related to sustainability and historic preservation in the American South, the Ohio Valley, and in Lexington. And here he's the chair of the Historic Preservation Program. So I'll turn that over to Jeremy to tell us about this exciting project.
Thank you, Emily. Many of you who listened to this introduction and many of you who know me probably wonder why am I here speaking about Benjamin Gratz and Gratz Park when I am supposed to be a respectable historian of the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution. Partly it has been a defensive maneuver because of the pandemic. I was not able to go to Europe as I usually do every summer to continue research on projects there, and I needed to think of something to do that could be done while sitting in Lexington. But in a way, it has also grown out of my experience living in Lexington, Kentucky. I moved here more than 40 years ago now, and I have been a member of Lexington's Jewish community ever since I arrived. And one of the first things I learned when I moved here was that there had been this Jewish resident, Benjamin Gratz, and that this little park in downtown Lexington was named for him, and that his house still stands on the park. So for me, as somebody coming to Lexington from outside, it was intriguing to learn that there had been an early Jewish resident who had been sufficiently important in the city's life to have this prominent public feature named after him. It is, as far as I know, the only geographic site in Lexington that is named for a Jew, except I think for Julius Marx Elementary School. I believe that Julius Marx was also Jewish, but I haven't been able to find out much about him. There may be people here who know more than that, than I do about that. So I knew that Benjamin Gratz was part of Jewish history, and in addition to my courses on French history and the course I've taught for many years on the Holocaust, I have taught courses, and I'm teaching a course this semester on modern Jewish history in which American Jewish history figures. So I had a little bit of background in this, but I had never really done much research on Benjamin Gratz, nor, I have to say, does it seem that anybody else has. I've found very little published literature about him. The entry on him in the Kentucky Encyclopedia, which is the standard reference book about Kentucky history, has a short article on him, but does not even mention that he's Jewish or was Jewish. So it was clear that not many people knew much about him. And in the fall of 2019, I got involved in a project that had been launched by my wife, Beata. She organized an event called Nature Hop, in which she worked with the city's Environmental Preservation Commission to organize tours of green spaces around Lexington, parks and other forms of green space, and to get people to lead little walking tours of them. So I cheerfully volunteered to lead a tour of Gratz Park, which she didn't plan to include in her program because from her ecological point of view, it's not a very interesting park. We took a walk around there, and she said, there are no interesting plants here, and the only living animals I see are squirrels. What are you going to say about them? But that led me to do some research, first of all about Benjamin Gratz, and then about the history of the park and its place in the larger history of Lexington. So I found out a number of things about Benjamin Gratz, but the most striking thing, and one thing that I had never heard mentioned, if you think about prosperous white people in Lexington before the Civil War, you have to assume that they were owners of enslaved Black people. But it had never occurred to me that Benjamin Gratz might have owed his wealth essentially to the exploitation of captive Black labor until I saw what's called the slave schedule in the 1850 US Census, which we have in special collections in the library, and saw Benjamin Gratz listed as the owner of 65 enslaved Blacks. I need to go back at some point. I'm not sure that this makes him the largest slave owner in Lexington, but by comparison, Henry Clay, this nationally known figure who had a large estate here in Lexington, owned only about 50 slaves. So Gratz was certainly up there as far as slaveholding was concerned in Lexington. So I realized there is a side to the Benjamin Gratz story that needs to be explored, that he clearly made the money that allowed him to become such a prominent civic figure in Lexington because he exploited slave labor. He did not own a plantation like Henry Clay, but one of the things I discovered is we need to think of Lexington in the first half of the 19th century, not so much as a part of a plantation economy, but part of an industrial economy. And the industry was hemp processing and rope making. And Benjamin Gratz's fortune was due to owning a large rope factory, I think along today's 2nd Street, where he turned where his slaves turned hemp fiber into rope, and Lexington supplied the ropes that were used by those clipper ships and all the other sailing vessels of the time. So this was the source, the main source of the city's wealth. So I realized it was important to explore Gratz's involvement in the employment of slave labor when it becomes possible to do research in the city's public records office. Colleagues have told me I can expect to find records of his buying and selling slaves and to be able to document this more thoroughly than I've been able to. I was also interested, however, in the history of Gratz Park, and in the paper that I hope many of you had a chance to read, you will see that after the Civil War, slavery is abolished and Benjamin Gratz is by then retired. He will finally die at the age of 92 in 1884. But one of his sons, a man named Howard Gratz, becomes the manager of the park property, and there's a long story about the relationship of the park to Transylvania University, which was the original owner, and spent some 60 or 70 years trying to disentangle itself from the park. But to me, the most striking thing about the period when Howard Gratz is in charge of the property is that it becomes an aspect of the city during the era of segregation and Jim Crow, because Howard Gratz fences off the park in order to make it, as he says to one of the local newspapers, a place for respectable white people. So everybody else will be, excluded from the park, but it will become a safe place for white people. And Melanie Goen can probably tell you more than I can about the role it then plays, for example, in Lexington's women's suffrage movement, because it is a safe place for the gatherings that they want to hold where people can't come and heckle them so easily. So the park becomes a part of the city's history and the history of the Jim Crow era in Lexington. And then there is an interesting story about how it becomes a city park, even after the voters vote overwhelmingly by 3-1 against spending any city money to acquire it in the early 20th century. And then there's a third story that I think is important to research, which I haven't yet had a chance to develop very much more than I have in the paper, but that is the question of the role of the park as the first cause taken up by the historic preservation movement in Lexington in the mid-1950s. And I see Dan shaking his head, so he's probably going to tell us more about that. But what becomes the Bluegrass Trust, which has played such a huge role in historic preservation efforts in Lexington, is originally founded to safeguard Gratz Park and particularly the Hunt Morgan House on the southwest corner of the park in 1955. And of course, what that means is that the park becomes identified with a vision of what's worth saving about Lexington's past that emphasizes this pre-Civil War period and above all highlights the house of the family of the most prominent Confederate general from Lexington, John Hunt Morgan, and the Daughters of the Confederacy, as they did in so many places around the country, sponsored the building of a statue to John Hunt Morgan, which all of us remember standing in front of the county courthouse until 2017. But that statue was originally meant to go in Gratz Park in front of the, on the park side of the Carnegie Library building. And had it been put there, there would have been no doubt about the association between the park and the romanticization of the lost cause. So in my mind, the project that I've kind of outlined but have not really been able to pursue because for reasons you all know, I cannot at the moment easily go into the Kentucky room at the public library, for example, to access the local newspapers that they have on microfilm, or the Public Records Office, or the archives of Transylvania University, where Benjamin Gratz was on the Board of Trustees for 61 years, or many of the other sources that I as a historian would want to look at. But someday when we've all been vaccinated, I hope to be able to take up this project again and pursue its implications for American Jewish history, for the history of race relations in Lexington, and for its place in the understanding of the historic preservation movement, which I have to say is now radically changing. And instead of kind of keeping alive a certain romantic image of Lexington, the Athens of the West, places like Ashland, the Henry Clay Estate, are now doing an outstanding job in documenting the place of Lexington in the system of slavery in the United States. And I think that's what I'm hoping this project, when I'm actually able to do it, will help our understanding of. So I'll stop there and let Dan take over here.
So thank you, Jeremy, and thanks to everyone for logging on to this talk. I find this to be a really interesting and engaging paper, and I think we all owe Jeremy a gesture of thanks for sharing it in an interesting and very coherent, easily readable form, but also a form that's as yet undeveloped in all the ways that he spoke of wanting to develop it because of the pandemic. And I think today's conversation will undoubtedly help think about next steps and research goals, and hopefully he and the rest of us will be able to get back to actually going to archives and doing this kind of work before too long. I have just a few comments to offer, and I suspect that these will hopefully frame the paper a little bit, but also stimulate thinking from other people on this session, and suggest strategies for developing the paper. As somebody who's very interested in public history and how people relate to particular places and historical associations with them, I really like this paper. I commend Jeremy for writing it at a time when you know, there's the recent events that we've all been reading about in the news, and people are undertaking new scrutiny of Confederate symbols and other historical symbols. And to my mind, this is exactly the sort of paper that capable historians should be writing to help the public writ large think more critically and in a more informed way about who's been commemorated in their communities, what places are associated with people commemorated from earlier generations, and what do we really know about them. So it seems to me that one of the paper's strengths is that it interrogates something that's seemingly commonplace and seemingly mundane or innocuous until you start probing the question about who Gratz was and what led this place to be memorialized in his name, right? And so in that way, it, you know, makes a place that we're all known, that we're all familiar with. It takes it from being more than just a geographic referent and makes it a historical problem, and a really interesting one at that. I also think that the way the paper has a self-reflective tone, and it introduces us to the problem, but then dismantles Gratz's veneer kind of incrementally, the way Jeremy shows us that he's not only a slaveholder, and therefore, the explanation that he's of Jewish heritage and therefore he's trying to assimilate and fit in the kind of standard narrative. Gratz becomes, one of the largest slave owners in Lexington during his time, and somebody who's benefiting tremendously from the institution. And that is obviously very, very important. I also think there's this interesting thread that runs throughout the paper about Gratz's religion and the ability to demonstrate that despite his marrying two Gentile women and being a lone Jew in Lexington and Kentucky during his lifetime, he continues to practice some aspects of Judaism throughout his life, and that certainly makes for an interesting and important part of the story. Jeremy, I think, hinted at this a little bit, but when I think about where the paper might be developed and how it might benefit from attention to additional subjects, I think the main one I have is a question of audience, which is, it seems to me the paper in its current form is mainly written, I think, for a local Jewish audience, or an audience that's interested in local Jewish history, and it works very well in that regard. But there are certainly quite a few other audiences that would benefit from hearing this story, or the more developed version when that becomes available. And so Jeremy, like all of us, has limited time, but I can see a paper that's aimed at the general public or people interested in Lexington history in general. Clearly, there's a story about race relations in Lexington, and that part of Lexington's history. Certainly, this would make for a really interesting exhibit or some sort of non-narrative, or some sort of exhibit or more public presentation of historical information as a way to share this with a larger audience than simply people that are interested in Lexington history and Lexington's Jewish heritage. So lots of possibilities and lots of options. And of course, we have limited time, but I think the public dimensions of this are really interesting to explore. It seems to me there are a couple places where this paper might be more developed, especially when it becomes possible to get at the sources. The one that really stands out at me, and I think is informed in part as I'm learning more about Lexington's history with slavery, is I would like to see if there are sources that allow you to say something about Gratz's personal relationship with enslaved people and the physical presence or kind of day-to-day aspects of slavery. So the paper, as it's written, slavery functions as a form of property ownership and kind of this abstract ideological problem. But I can't help but think that Gratz's papers, or perhaps some of his correspondence with the family, any kind of personal commentary of his that allows us to get at questions about how he interacted with enslaved people, whether domestic slaves in his house, laborers at his factory, or simply other people in Lexington, that would be really interesting and important, because again, it makes the institution less of an institution and more about power relationships in society and on a face-to-face kind of level. And it seems to me, based on what I know about the Gratz family and the people involved here, that there might be those kinds of sources available. I also think, and again, here I'm getting up to speed on the history of slavery in Lexington. I also think that there's an opportunity to tell a story about change over time that doesn't come across here. And so when Gratz arrives in Lexington, and you're absolutely right, Jeremy, I mean, it's hemp processing and production of goods made from hemp that's the main industry here. And so Lexington's a small town. It's an agricultural hub, but its enslavement, the labor system is about processing hemp, but that begins to change in the 1840s and especially the 1850s. And what strikes me about what I'm now reading and digging into here is how much Lexington becomes a clearinghouse for enslaved people as part of the domestic slave trade and the movement of enslaved people to the deep South, to the old Southwest in Mississippi and Louisiana. So I don't know if there are sources that allow you to get at Gratz's awareness of that, but if there are, it's wonderful. If not, it's still possible to say something about the changing presence of slavery in Lexington. And so, for instance, just in my rough calculation based on some sources I've consulted, I think by the mid-1850s, there would have been either slave jails or pretty crude slave pens associated with slave dealers within between 3 and 6 or 7 blocks of Gratz's residence. I mean, the way in which they had a presence in the city, and anybody here would have been aware of the movement of chattels and the sort of commodification of human beings. And I can't help but think there's a way to make the point about how morally troubling slavery is in this moment as the sectional crisis escalates, and how Gratz, as anyone in Lexington, could not have avoided thinking about the breaking up of families, the sale of people, so on and so forth. So that strikes me as a real opportunity. Mm-hmm. I do think that there might be a little, something of an opportunity to highlight how important the Gratz family is in Jewish historiography and the history of Jews in America. You've got that nice line about them being the most prominent family in early America or something to that effect. But as I started doing a little background reading for the sake of this talk, these are clearly people that people familiar with Jewish history and the study of Jewish life in America would be familiar with, and that's an interesting connection to highlight. The last point I want to make is something that I, again, think about quite often as somebody that produces historical content for public audiences and is really interested in the way the public understands history and engages with it. And I have to say that I found this, I've sort of sensed this when I read the paper when you first shared it with me this summer, and I can now actually put words to this. But I'd ask all of us on this call, what's the most powerful message this paper, or a more evolved form of it can leave us with? So my question there is, this paper does a really good job of exploring who Gratz was, exploring his relationship to slavery, exploring the problem of him as a commemorated figure now that our awareness of the legacy of slavery and the problem of race in contemporary America are so at the forefront of mind. And it seems to me what the paper mainly does is something that's pretty typical of work by good historians aimed at public audiences, which is that it exposes, it lays out this story, it lays out the problem, and it highlights the contradictions and the moral questions that we have to deal with in understanding Gratz's life. And so my question is that enough? Now, clearly, it's not good historical practice to get into moralizing or telling people how to think, but especially as we've had, again, another summer of removal of Confederate statues and dismantling of Confederate symbols and everything else that we're all familiar with. I am really interested in how we connect historical problems with contemporary life and the problems that we continue to deal with because of longstanding historical inequalities that have been perpetuated. And, you know, we're all familiar with this story. So one of the possibilities that it seems to me may be available here is to make the point that, you know, people that get memorialized are neither, I mean, rarely are they saints and rarely are they as heroic as history remembers them to be. Human beings are complicated. And fortunately, because of recent discussions and debates, our society is becoming more comfortable with that idea. And, you know, here's a story about somebody who has been commemorated and for a long time taken to be sort of a civic father figure. And yet, you know, he's an incredibly problematic figure historically. So I'm not suggesting that there's a message about contemporary action or engagement with contemporary social problems that derives from this paper, but I do think there's still important work to be done in simply getting across the idea to public audiences that history is always messy. That's the nature of human affairs. And we don't have to necessarily celebrate people, but if we're going to understand them and how they were part of their time, that's important work for us to do as a society. And it also should be, in a self-reflective way, hopefully a path towards better interrogation of the problems we exist amid and struggle with in our independent and collective lives. I don't know what you do with that. I don't have a clear idea of how I'd handle it if I were doing the work you're doing, Jeremy, but I do think it's worth thinking about. And then real quick, just because you brought it up, and it is an important part of the story, you know, the role of the Bluegrass Trust in historic preservation here in Lexington, that I have come to realize is a more important history locally and regionally than I have appreciated until very recently, or maybe still don't. It's also interesting to me that I've just recently learned that that organization was sort of coached and informed by people from Historic Charleston Foundation when it was organized. And that is something that I intend to look into and will certainly share with you. I think the challenge there in dealing with that part of the story is to give full appreciation to the motivations of the people involved. And so, you know, knowing what motivated white Southerners in mid-century America, there's no question that a sort of romanticization of the past and celebration of the Confederacy was part of it. I also understand, and I think this is fairly typical of the way preservation is a response to crisis and impending threat, that there was a proposal to locate the junction of I-64 and I-75 in the middle of Gratz Park, and there was certainly the problem about migration to the suburbs and decline of close-in property. So my not well-informed comment here is, in telling that Bluegrass Trust story, it's going to be important to interrogate the full scope of motivations, because certainly there's a certain set of histories they're privileging and other people's are being ignored, and that has major repercussions. But I also would not be surprised to find if they're not very driven by immediate concerns to sense of place and neighborhood integrity and that sort of thing. So I hope this has been helpful. I appreciate you inviting me to comment, and I really enjoyed the paper, and I'm excited to hear what other people have to say and what questions they have to pose.
Thank you so much, Dan. Jeremy, would you like to respond first to what Dan posed? We also have already, I think, 5 or 6 questions that have been posed in the chat, so plenty of things.
I want to get to the questions as quickly as possible. I just want to thank Dan for his very thoughtful comments, and many of these are ideas I have thought about myself already, but you give me some useful ideas about how to develop them. I am hoping material that might throw some light on Gratz's relations with the enslaved people he was in contact with will come to light. For those of you who haven't had a chance to take the new tour about slavery at the Henry Clay estate, certainly one of the most powerful moments of it is when the guide reads from a testimony provided by one man who had been enslaved at the Ashland plantation and escaped through the Underground Railroad to Canada and spoke about his experiences. Direct testimonies like that, of course, are rare, and I don't know if material like that will turn out about Gratz. It seems fairly clear that he did not own a plantation, and whether he had such close relations with individual slaves other than perhaps domestic servants as Clay did at his plantation is still a question I need to try to answer. And certainly to your last point, I think we all recognize that Lexington has benefited from the historic preservation efforts of the Bluegrass Trust. And as I was elaborating my thoughts about this project, I was thinking this has the potential to outrage many different audiences. The Jewish community, which has been touchy about really exploring the relationship between Jews and slavery in the pre-Civil War South, the historic preservation community, which is a group that feels perpetually embattled and does not always want take kindly to having its motives put in question. So I may yet get driven out of town for doing this project. But I think you correctly identified the reasons why in our present historic moment, it seems to me we have to be willing to look honestly at these questions, and that we need a new understanding of how Lexington grew that broadens our thoughts beyond the phrase, the Athens of the West, and we need a understanding of American Jewish life that is more nuanced than it has been up to now. And I'll stop there and let other people pose their questions. And Emily, I assume you're going to coordinate things here.
Yeah, I have a set of things for you. And so what I'll do is I'll read off some of the questions from the chat, and then we'll let the people who have their hands raised ask their questions. So thankfully you're not physically raising your hands, because we might have a few of them, and then we'll come back again. So I just wanted to share a couple comments that were shared in the chat that people might have scrolled past. So Jan Fernheimer shared a reference on Julius Marx. Kathy Newfont shares that the Fayette County Clerk's Office is now open to researchers by appointment. Jim Albacete shared some facts from the New History of Kentucky. So Gratz lost 7 slaves in the 1833 cholera epidemic. 19 were lost in the hemp bag factory of James Brand. And Gratz was a business partner of the namesake of Old Morrison at Transylvania. And then Sarah Lowe also shared that the Andrew Mellon Foundation just pledged $250 million to reimagine monuments. So those are all coming from different points in the talk, but everyone might think of the connections. The first question, Jeremy, would you like me to read a couple questions and then you can respond? Or I have 5.
Well, I'll let you judge how well related they are to each other.
Yeah, okay. Well, we have a few about these are all about Gratz himself rather than legacy. Okay. So I'll ask them all in a clump. Yeah. So we have a question from Jim Albacete. Could you say more about his 2 marriages to Christians and the religion of his children? How did the Philadelphia main branches of the family respond to that? Related question from Francie Chasen-Lopez is the question of how Gratz continued to practice Judaism in a totally Christian environment. Did he, or do you know if he had a library with any Jewish literature in it? How about we'll do those two, and then the next two are similar as well.
Yeah, these questions get at one of the things that kind of intrigues me about this project. Here is Benjamin Gratz. He was clearly a very important person in Lexington civic life and part of this very important American Jewish family. And yet as a person, he's kind of a blank. I have not yet encountered an interesting personal anecdote that would tell us anything about his character. I'm hoping when I might be able to explore the newspapers from Lexington that maybe he wrote in a letter to the editor or something at some point. But you don't learn much about his personality, and that's something I'm still somewhat puzzled about. Our biggest source on his personality are the letters from his sister. His sister, Rebecca Gratz, is a very important figure in American Jewish history and certainly much better known than Benjamin himself, the founder of the first Sunday school in America, and she kind of established as a pattern for Jewish women's involvement in philanthropic activities in Philadelphia. And many of you probably know the story that she is supposedly the model for the character Rebecca in Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, although that has been questioned. But Rebecca Gratz, as it turns out, actually corresponds primarily with Gratz's two wives. She complains constantly that Ben never writes, and clearly he left it to the wives to keep up the connection with his family back in Philadelphia. So Jim, that is kind of what I can say in answer to your question. The wives, the family back in Philadelphia knows that these wives are Christian. They send Rebecca greetings for Passover, and she sends them greetings for Easter and so forth. As far as I know, none of his children identify as Jews. They all marry into other prominent Christian families. In 1884, when Gratz is buried, the very famous rabbi from Cincinnati, the founder of Hebrew Union College, Isaac Mayer Wise, comes down to conduct the funeral, and he supposedly quips that there were only 2 Jews present at the cemetery, at the ceremony, himself and the corpse. This seems to me unlikely because there were other Jewish families living in Lexington by that time. And in the paper, I mention evidence that Gratz must have had contact with them because I include the story told by that totally reliable witness, George Armstrong Custer, about witnessing the kosher slaughtering of a cow on Gratz's farm property in Midway. And Gratz could not possibly have cared about kosher meat. He couldn't have lived in Lexington for 30 years as the only Jew if he was only eating kosher food. But by then there were other Jews in Lexington, and my suspicion is that they had arranged with him to carry out the kosher slaughtering on his farm so that they could have the meat. That is, in a sense, that's about all I've been able to come up with about Gratz, the person, and his family relations here in Lexington and the kind of life he led.
Great, thank you. So some questions from Leon Ravin. He had 2 questions also about Gratz's personal history, but what role did Gratz play at Transylvania College other than being on the board? And what, if any, connection did he have with Daniel Boone? And then Jolene McCommons had a question. Could you talk about the intervention that Gratz made on his neighbor, Mrs. Morgan's behalf? What was the intervention?
Mhm.
And does her diary give other clues about the tensions between the Union and Confederacy and such close proximity between neighbors?
Yeah. Okay. Let me remind me about Leon's question again.
Sorry,
Memory is-
Transylvania. So what was Gratz's role at Transylvania besides the board? And did he have any connection with Daniel Boone?
Okay. As soon as I can get into the Transylvania archives, when this semester is over and when access becomes easier, I hope to be able to answer that question. I kind of intuit that he was on the board probably for two main reasons. One is he was clearly one of the richest people in Lexington. That's why every organization wanted him on their board. And secondly, Transylvania was constantly split by furious arguments between the more liberal Protestants or Unitarians and the more fundamentalist or Presbyterians on the board. And it strikes me that Gratz was probably the only person in town who they could both regard as a neutral party. You know, he wasn't, couldn't be suspected of bias in one direction or the other. So he may have played a kind of mediating role in these furious controversies that led to the dismissal of presidents and the ousting of professors from the faculty at several critical moments in Trancy's history. He was a neighbor of Transylvania. Transylvania University's main building was in what is now Gratz Park when he built his house there. And of course, it then moved north of 3rd Street, but you know, he was still a neighbor and directly involved with it. The question about Daniel Boone, I mentioned in the paper that when I visited the Museum of American Jewish History a couple of years ago, I saw that they have a letter from Daniel Boone, not to Benjamin Gratz, but I think to his father, Michael, about land grants in the you know, out in the West, as it was in those days. The Gratz family, which consists of two brothers who are merchants in Philadelphia, Barnard and Michael. Michael is Benjamin's father. Clearly was very heavily involved in land speculation in the West. So if you want to put the worst possible spin on the Gratz family's involvement in American history, first, the older generation helps dispossess the Indians of land all over the Ohio Valley. And then the next generation, some of them settle out here and become slave owners in Kentucky. Benjamin Gratz is not the only member of the family who does that. But that is clearly where much of the family money came from speculating in land grants in the West. And Benjamin Gratz, we have to assume that, you know, he moves to Lexington in 1819. By 1823, is a partner in this large rope manufactory. By 1830, he owns 75 slaves. You have to assume that when he comes here, he comes with quite a bit of money. He's not a penniless immigrant who works his way up, but you know, he comes from one of the wealthiest families in America of the day, and that's how he is able to establish himself so rapidly, marry into another well-to-do family in Lexington, and become a part of the city's elite in just a matter of a couple of years. Let's see, and then there was Jillian's question. Yeah, I'm sorry. Hi, Jillian, very nice to see you. The material about Gratz and the Hunt Morgan family comes from the diary of the daughter of a man named Robert Peter, who's a faculty member at Transylvania and one of the first historians of Lexington in the 19th century. And he lives on Gratz Park too. And Gratz lives next door to the Hunt Morgan family. And as you probably know, and Amy Taylor certainly knows, Union headquarters is on the other side of the park. So you've got the mother of this leading Confederate general on one side of the park, the Union commander in Lexington on the other. And she was in danger of being interned as a Confederate sympathizer. And Benjamin Gratz, according to Peter's daughter's diary, intervened to assure the Union commander that she wasn't posing a problem. So he acts as a good neighbor, but I can't help thinking there's something symbolic about the fact that Kentucky is a divided state during the Civil War. Gratz Park is a divided park at that point. And Benjamin Gratz, who is pro-union but not anti-slavery, obviously, seems to play this kind of mediating role. Everybody sees him as somebody everybody trusts, and if he vouches for Mrs. Morgan, then the Union commander will leave her alone. The Peter family is a strongly pro-union family, and they're friends with Gratz too. So, clearly one of his talents is he knows how to get along with everybody and not rub anybody the wrong way. And that is, I think, in a way, a larger strategy of many American Jews in the 19th century. Establish yourself as a good citizen, give money to all the good causes in town, as Gratz does, and don't get involved in politics and don't get into arguments with, with other people. And that way, Jews will be seen as good members of the community, and they will be tolerated. If I could just add one thought to that. This morning I talked to my students in the Jewish history class I'm teaching about Ulysses S. Grant's notorious Order Number 11 in 1862, expelling Jews from the war zone in Tennessee on the claim that they were all profiteering from the army. And I reminded students that at this moment in American history, Jews worried that they might be, that the tradition that went back to George Washington of treating them as equal citizens might be in real danger. And that is perhaps something to bear in mind in thinking about Gratz in the Civil War also, that, it's important for him to be in good with both sides, so to speak, in order to make sure that he didn't contribute to any kind of backlash against Jews, such as what's reflected in Grant's order.
Thanks, Jeremy. So now we'll have a couple questions from folks live and slow down the pace a little bit. The first question is from Richard, or Richard's iPad. I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. So if you could just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question. All right, I'll unmute you, and you should be able to speak.
This is more of just a reaction, but how could someone who celebrates Passover engage in the slave trade? I mean,
well, all we can say is we have to assume that American Jews who lived in the South before the Civil War, not to mention Jews in other parts of the Americas, in Suriname, for example, and in Brazil, that they did celebrate Passover with its message that we take to be an anti-slavery message, and that they managed to live with that contradiction. And I can't really tell you more than that. As far as I know, Gratz leaves no record of his inner thoughts on that subject.
Amy Taylor?
Okay. My dogs are just barking, so I hope I have some time here. So Jeremy, thank you so much for this. I have so many thoughts and questions. It's so interesting. The question I have for you is, one thing that I noticed in reading it is you never quite came out and called him white. I wonder if that was deliberate or not. And I have some comments, but I wonder if you
that. To be quite honest, Amy, it never occurred to me. I mean, he comes here, no person of known African ancestry could have functioned as he did in the Lexington community. been allowed to marry into a local white family, taken in as a business partner by other white people. So I guess I just took it for granted that it was obvious that people reacted to him as if he was white.
Mm-hmm.
And no doubt the fact that he arrived with a lot of money had something to do with
Well,
it.
yeah. I mean, I noticed the thing you said, how American Gentiles accepted Jews as whites. And
Yeah.
I sort of stumbled on that sentence a little bit because I'm not sure it's quite that clear. Because of course, whiteness was arguably defined much more narrowly in this time than later. And I think what you just said, I think class is the important variable here that did give him some of that entree. And so for that reason, I would think about his slaveholding potentially as not a privilege he was given because he was white, but the thing that like helped make him white. That his race was, this was like a process over the course of his life, and slaveholding helped him achieve that by, maintaining his status in that certain class. I don't know, just a thought on race here, or something maybe a little bit more complicated in his life.
Yeah.
So that's my question.
Well, I really look forward to a more extended conversation with you because obviously these are issues you have spent a lot of time researching and thinking about.
Well, I actually even just have little comments about Lexington we can talk about later, but I did come across that he was a pallbearer for John J. Crittenden. Just a little factoid there. I don't know if you knew that.
He organizes the committee to raise funds for the building of the Henry Clay statue and the cemetery. He's a pallbearer, I think, for Clay's funeral. Also, he knows everybody there is to know in Lexington.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'll bring up one question that was in the chat, and then I see that Jim Albacetti has his hand raised. And so the question from the chat was from Jan Fernheimer, which was, what do you know about Gratz's farm in Woodford County? Where was it located, and did he have enslaved people there? And actually, Jonathan Glickson shared that he looked at a document, and he's linked it in the chat, regarding the Big Sink historical area in Woodford County, which includes the Gratz farm, which has remnants of structures that appear to be slave quarters. I don't know if you want to add to that in terms of the question about the farm in Woodford County, Jeremy?
Well, Jonathan obviously knows more about it than I do at the moment. I'm aware that he had a farm out there. The location is known. Gratz Avenue is one of the main streets in Midway, and so he was obviously a major figure there. I've been referred to people at the Woodford County Historical Society and the library there, and I have no doubt that I'll find further information when it becomes easier to actually function as a research historian again in central Kentucky, and I'm looking forward to that. I have no doubt also that he had enslaved people there. And if I can do just a moment of show and tell here, hang on a second. When I found out about his farm and the kosher slaughtering, I got very excited because when I first moved to Lexington, I once found in a used bookstore in Georgetown a Hebrew book. You probably can't see it very well. The Theoretical and Practical Kosher Slaughterer, according to the rules of Rabbi J. Weil, published in Germany in 1865. And I've had this on my shelf for a long time as a kind of piece of Jewish memorabilia. But suddenly I asked myself the question, is it possible that this kosher slaughtering manual eventually wound up in Georgetown, Kentucky, because it belonged to Benjamin Gratz? And so I rushed to the bookshelf and was somewhat saddened to find that it's inscribed in the back, this book belongs to Henry Zinsheimer, Cincinnati, 1873. Still it is evidence that there was kosher slaughtering going on in the region. There were people who had the instruction manual so that they could do it properly. And well, I can't connect the book to the operation in Midway. You know, it's close.
Thanks. I think maybe, Jan, that answers your follow-up question about the documentation on the kosher slaughter.
Yeah, the answer to Jan's specific question is George Armstrong Custer, while he is stationed in Lexington in the early 1870s, he's buying horses for the United States Army's cavalry regiments. And of course, he goes to his death riding a mount from the bluegrass. But he also wrote newspaper columns. So in one of his columns, he describes visiting Gratz and witnessing the kosher slaughtering on his farm.
Thanks. So we have a question from Jim Albacetti.
Oh, first, Jeremy, Jane Phillips' maternal grandmother went to Simon Gratz High School in Philadelphia, which is now a charter school, but it was way in the Northeast, near where Wilson Good bombed Philadelphia 20 years ago. But I was wondering, as you think about this issue of the unexpected slaveholder, it's been 30 years since I read Theda Purdue's book on Elias Boudinot, the Cherokee slave owner. I wonder if thinking back to that might give you some other perspectives, just an odd, off the top of my head thought.
Yeah, well, you know, in the larger scheme of things, it is clear that for all the centuries that slavery and the slave trade persisted in the Atlantic world, there were Jews involved in every aspect of it, you know, as slave traders, as slave owners. They obviously did not think of this as something you know, peculiar. It is not true, as has been alleged by some anti-Semites, that Jews inspired or ran the slave trade, but they saw business opportunities in it the same way non-Jews did, and often pursued them. But in Benjamin Gratz's case, as I said in the paper, there is something that bothers me. He doesn't grow up in the South. He doesn't grow up in a slave society. He grows up in Philadelphia, which is one of the centers of the American abolitionist movement, which is very active during the years of his childhood. And when he comes out west, he goes first to Indiana, which is a free state. And had he met a nice girl in Vincennes, Indiana, instead of Lexington, you know, he might never have gotten involved in the slave trade. But I think it's fair to assume that he is familiar with abolitionist arguments from growing up in Philadelphia. And he comes here and he clearly makes a choice. He decides, I'm going to live here, and this is how you make money here. And so I think there is an element of responsibility, you know, moral responsibility that can't just be, you know, put aside by saying, well, of course, he just conforms to the society that he grew up in and the values of everybody around him.
So we had a question also from Leon Raven. I'll unmute you.
Okay, sorry that our computer skipped just as you were introducing me. I'd like to know if there is any connection between the Gratz family and the Wheel family. I don't know how far back the Wheel family first came to the Lexington area, but I do know that they were also heavily involved in the hemp industry. And I wonder if there were family and business ties between the two of them.
That's interesting. I'll have to ask you more about that. I don't know when they arrived. It's pretty clear that all of Gratz's children marry other Christians, so I don't think there are any family ties there. I don't know about business ties.
Okay. And I'd like to make a suggestion just about the owning of slaves.
Yeah.
And if part of what Jews were really concerned about at the time and even later on in American history was blending in to the communities that they were a part of, so as to appear less as outsiders. And I wonder if some of that, aside from monetary gain, etc., if some of that had some influence on Benjamin Gratz's going along with slave ownership.
You know, it's obvious that he could not have become a prominent citizen in Lexington had he been an outspoken opponent of slavery. But as I said a moment ago, he had, you know, he could have lived anywhere. He could have stayed in Philadelphia. He could have settled in Indiana, where the first place in the West that he goes to. He chooses to come to Lexington and spend his whole life there. And so obviously he decides that, you know, the price of being a success in Lexington is to, you know, be involved in slave ownership. And Dan Vivian raised the question about Lexington as a slave market in the 1840s and 50s. Gratz sells the majority of his slaves in sometime shortly after 1850. In the 1850 census, he's shown with 65 slaves. In 1860, he's got 10, and we know that he retired from business. So it's not impossible that I'm going to find in the Public Records Office a record of a massive slave sale early 1850s, and you're entirely right. He may have sold these people to traders who sold them down the river, as they said in those days. I have no way of knowing. By then, as you also know, the hemp business was kind of declining, and I don't know whether there would have been anybody who would have purchased his workforce along with his rope works, or whether the rope works simply went out of business. But one way or another, he certainly disposed of most of his enslaved people, and it might be possible to find out what happened to some of them.
Thanks, Jeremy. So we have a couple questions in the chat. I was wondering, maybe I'll call in some of the people with their hands raised so that we can make sure that we have their questions out there, and then we'll come back to the chat. So Phil Harling.
Phil, you're still muted.
I can't believe I'm still doing that. Thank you for a really wonderful paper from which I learned everything, because I knew nothing about it up until today. I'm going to ask you a mischievous and maybe in a way ahistorical question, because it's late on a Friday afternoon. Now that we know what we know about Gratz, what do we do about Gratz Park?
Yeah. Well, that is a big question. You know, we have recently renamed Cheapside Park for Henry Taney as a gesture toward a different vision of what Lexington's history was and who should be acknowledged. And I said in the paper, this is kind of you know, a tough question for me. As a member of Lexington's Jewish community, I have always taken certain pride in the fact that one part of the city honors a Jewish resident. If the park was renamed, you know, there would be no site other than Julius Marx Elementary School honoring a Lexington Jew for their contributions to the community. On the other hand, if we're going to rename Gratz Park, that is only going to be the beginning. I cannot imagine how many sites, streets, and so on in Lexington are named for people who owned slaves, starting with Lafayette, for whom Fayette County is named. Most Americans don't know, but he owned through his wife a very large plantation in what is today French Guiana. I've seen figures as high as 1,000 slaves that would have made it larger than any plantation anywhere in the United States. But everything that's named for Henry Clay, of course, and any number of other things. We have 120 counties in the state of Kentucky. I don't know if Melanie Goen or one of our other colleagues in Kentucky history has an estimate of how many of them are named for slave owners, but it's got to be, I would say, probably more than half. No, Melanie, and maybe more than that.
Yeah, I've not really thought of it, but yeah, I would say it's more than half.
Yeah. So, we would really have to have a conversation about all the names and the way they reflect the history of the community and what they say about the history of the community.
Thanks. And then a question from Tim Minella. And then if you asked a question in the chat, I promise I'll come back to it.
Thank you. Jeremy, I really enjoyed this. It's one of my favorite spots in Lexington, and I had no idea the history of it. So I really
didn't ruin it for you.
Sorry.
I said, I hope I didn't ruin it for you.
And you probably considered a lot of my points that I'm going to make already, but I was very much fascinated by the suggestions in parts of your paper about the role of slavery in urban settings. And more we're learning from histories being written about slavery now that how flexible it was as a labor system. That although the agricultural basis of much of the Southern economy, due to slavery, it did retard to a certain extent industrialization. There are many examples of business owners in the South, and particularly in southern cities, using slavery in various ways as their labor force in industrial operations. So I was really interested in that part of it, which goes along with my other thought, which is, obviously there's a large Jewish population in southern cities. I'm thinking mostly of Charleston, South Carolina, has one of the oldest Jewish communities in the United States. And it seems like interesting that there's a connection there between Charleston being the hub of the Atlantic slave trade in the United States before it's shut down in the early 19th century, and Lexington becoming a hub of the domestic slave trade in the Upper South. So I guess my question or point, and I'm really interested to see what you find here, is if there's any connection at all that he has, not just with his relatives in Philadelphia, but with slave owners and perhaps Jewish slave owners in other southern cities, and to Daniel's point about his connection to the domestic slave trade in Lexington. So I really enjoyed this piece. Thank you for sharing it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. At this stage in the game, I don't know anything about his possible connections with Jews in Charleston or anywhere else in the South. So that, it's something I'll have to keep an eye out for if the sources provide any evidence on that point. There was another aspect to your question, and my tired brain has kind of lost it there. Do you remember what else?
I just made a comment about that you probably considered already, but I was just interested in the use of slavery in industrial production.
Yes. Well, Emily mentioned at the beginning that I have written on the Haitian Revolution, and particularly on the the role of the urban center in what was then Saint-Domingue, Cap Français, and the events that lead to the abolition of slavery there in 1793. So I'm very much aware of the differences between urban slavery and plantation slavery. In the Cap Français, which is a much bigger, more prosperous city in 1793 than Lexington is in the early 19th century, you have a population that is 75% enslaved Black people, and the whites cannot keep them totally under control. They usually live in their own housing and not, they're not housed on the property of their masters. They frequently are free to move about the city during the day. They're often hiring themselves out and working, and so their experience is quite different. And I don't know how much that reflects the conditions in Lexington. If you think about these people on these rope walks trudging back and forth for who knows how many hours a day, stretching those fibers to make rope, that is urban slavery, but it is different from what I read about in the sources in Saint-Domingue. And but at the same time, I would guess that those Blacks, when they do get off from work, that they're not living in Benjamin Gratz's house or in his property. They probably do have some greater degree of independence than plantation slaves.
So we're going to wrap up in about 10 minutes at 3:30. I wanted to share a few resources that people have been sharing in the chat. And I wanted to say that this has been a really lively conversation, both in the chat and in person. And so it's really exciting to have these resources shared. So Carson Ben shared that the, Gist family papers are available at the Kentucky Historical Society, which might be a good resource. Kopana Terry says that the Kentucky Gazette and many other historic Kentucky newspapers are freely available online at KentuckyNewspapers.org and through the Internet Archive. And then we had David Wirtschafter has been waiting for answers to questions patiently for a while. Yeah. So he had two questions. One question was, is there any correspondence or known interaction between Benjamin Gratz and Rabbi Bernhard Felsenthal? And he also asked, can hemp be grown in Indiana as easily as Kentucky? And Kathy Newfont jumped in to say that it was also grown in antebellum Indiana, but the scale seems to have been smaller than in Kentucky. And rope was also made from hemp in Indiana, but the labor system would have been different. So I don't know if you want to add to the question about hemp or just answer the question about the potential connection between Gratz and Felsenthal.
All I can say about that is I'm totally unaware of any connection with Felsenheimer. If Gratz had any connection with Jews outside of Lexington other than his sister, I haven't seen any trace of it yet.
Oh, and
of course, Rabbi Wise, who comes down to officiate at his funeral, I don't know if they had met prior to that.
Yeah, thank you. And I forgot to mention another resource that was mentioned by Melanie Goen, which is a podcast called The Reckoning that explores Central Kentucky's role in the domestic slave trade and features several UK colleagues, which she highly recommends.
Yeah, I heard it mentioned on NPR the other day, and I thought I'd better get to work on my project, or it may be too late. Somebody else will have done it.
Well, certainly, it seems like there's room for a lot of voices in here. And I would say that, as a historian of China and a person who's pretty new to Lexington, I've learned a whole lot about my local setting. And like Tim, someone that spends a lot of time going to Gratz Park.
Do we know who the first Chinese resident of Lexington was?
No, I don't.
We'd better find out.
Okay. I thought that was a pop quiz. I'm glad it wasn't. So we have another question also from the chat from Lowell Nygoff, which is, does it say in the Bible that Jews own slaves, or outline how they're treated? And David Wirtschafter jumped in to connect to this question, saying, the Torah places limits on owning fellow Israelites. Such protections and provisions apply to ownership and treatment of non-Israelites, but he doesn't know about Mishnah or Talmud. I don't know if you wanted to add to that question.
I beg your pardon. There should be a not in that sentence. Such provisions do not. I apologize.
Oh, okay.
The Bible definitely does mention slave owning by the Israelites, and provides various regulations on the treatment of slaves. But we read some of those passages in the last couple of months at services at the synagogue I participate in, and some of them are quite, quite uncomfortable to read today. But there is definitely no general prohibition on slavery in the Jewish Bible.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot to both Jeremy and to Dan for a really enlightening conversation, and one with a lot of potential in terms of thinking forward into the way that history is pictured in Lexington, as well as the way that Lexington is pictured within a broader story of the U.S. South and history of slavery and public commemoration. If you're going to join us again, we're going to have a session in 2 weeks from today that's going to be about environmental history, sponsored by our Environmental History Working Group, and I'll be sending out an email about that probably on Monday about that. So thank you all, and thanks to Jeremy and to Dan.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody for the wonderful turnout and the wonderful questions, and thank you, Emily, for organizing this, and Dan especially, thanks for your very thoughtful comments.